The hidden grief of people who think too deeply. The grief without a name. There is something you have been carrying for a long time that you have never been able to fully explain, even to yourself. It is not sadness in the way sadness is usually described, and it does not arrive with the kind of clear origin story that would make it easier to address. It is quieter than that, more persistent, a low-frequency mourning that lives beneath the surface of your daily functioning and remains present even on good days, even in moments that should feel complete, even when everything around you looks, by every external measure, perfectly fine. You are still showing up, still performing the version of yourself that the world around you recognizes, still saying the right things at the right times, engaging when engagement is expected. But underneath all of that, something in you has been grieving for years, and the most disorienting part is that you cannot name what you are grieving for. Nothing catastrophic happened, no loss that others would validate, no story you could tell that would make someone understand why you carry this particular weight. And so you have done what deeply thinking people almost always do with experiences that resist easy language. You have filed it away, returned to functioning, told yourself it is probably just the way you are. This is the grief that has no funeral. No one gathers around it. No one asks how you are holding up because from the outside nothing happened. And yet from the inside, something has been happening for a very long time. Something that touches the specific way your mind works, the depth at which you process experience, the cost of being someone who cannot move through the world at a surface level no matter how many times you have tried. People who think deeply do not just think more, they experience differently, feeling the undertow of situations that others move through without noticing, registering emotional subtext automatically and constantly, and without choosing to. They see implications before they arrive. They feel the weight of things not yet said, and they carry all of this without a structure for understanding what it is doing to them over time. Because the world does not have a sophisticated vocabulary for what deep thinking actually costs across years of a life lived at that frequency. The grief is real. It has weight and texture and a particular loneliness that is different from ordinary loneliness, because it is not caused by the absence of people. It is caused by the presence of people who are close enough to see you but not quite able to reach the part of you that most needs to be reached. Nothing is wrong with you, but something has been happening to you, quietly, for a long time, and it deserves to be named with the precision it has never been given. The weight of seeing too much. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that deeply thinking people carry that has no adequate name in common language, and because it has no name, it is almost never treated as the real and significant cost that it is. It presents as tiredness sometimes, or overstimulation, or the vague sense of needing to be alone without being able to articulate exactly why. But what is actually happening is more specific. The nervous system of a person who processes at depth is doing an enormous amount of work, constantly in environments designed for people who process at the surface, and that discrepancy accumulates in ways most deeply thinking people have never been given the language to understand about themselves. To think deeply is not simply to think more thoroughly about the same things everyone else notices. It is to notice fundamentally different things automatically, without the option of selective perception that makes ordinary social experience manageable for most people. When you walk into a room, you are not just registering faces and conversation. You are reading the tension underneath the conversation, the emotional history between the people in it, the things being carefully not said, the difference between what someone's words mean and what their body is communicating simultaneously. You are processing implication and subtext and relational dynamic in real time, without being asked to and without being able to stop. When a person processes at depth, every social interaction carries a cognitive and emotional load significantly heavier than what the same interaction costs someone processing at the surface. A conversation that lasts an hour might leave you needing 2 hours of solitude to return to equilibrium, not because you are fragile, but because you were doing substantially more perceptual and emotional work than the other person was. The imbalance is neurological, cumulative, and it explains a great deal about why deeply thinking people often move through the world with a baseline fatigue that rest alone does not seem to fix. When you see what others miss, you're living in a version of reality that is more complex, more layered, and in many ways more painful than the one most people around you inhabit. You see the fragility underneath confident performances. You see the loneliness inside crowded relationships. You see the ways people hurt each other without meaning to, the distance between what someone intends and what actually lands. You carry the emotional weight of that seeing without any particular outlet for it, because the people around you are not seeing the same things and therefore cannot share the weight of knowing them. This creates the isolation of perceiving a dimension of experience that others are not accessing, of living in a richer and more demanding version of shared reality, and of having no one to turn to and say, "Do you see this too?" Because usually, they do not. And over time, that gap becomes one of the quieter sources of grief in a deeply thinking person's life, persistent enough to shape the way you hold yourself back in conversations, the way you learn to keep the full range of your perception private, because sharing it has too often produced confusion or discomfort. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is evidence of how much you have been quietly carrying in plain sight, in every room you have ever walked into, for your entire life. The loneliness of the translator. There is a role that deeply thinking people fall into so early in life, and so automatically, that most of them have never recognized it as a role at all. They experience it simply as the way interaction works, as something so reflexive it has become indistinguishable from personality. But it is not personality. It is a survival adaptation, and it carries a cost that compounds quietly over decades until it becomes one of the central unexamined sources of exhaustion in a deeply thinking person's life. The role is translator. Not in the linguistic sense, but in the deeper sense of someone who perpetually stands between their own interior experience and the social world around them, converting what they actually perceive and feel and think into a form that people around them can receive without discomfort. Someone who has learned, through years of subtle feedback, that their unfiltered perception is too much for ordinary conversation to absorb, and who has therefore developed a largely unconscious process of editing themselves in real time, selecting which observations to voice and which to quietly set aside, calibrating the depth of their response to match the depth the room can hold. You have been doing this for so long that you probably do not notice anymore. It happens before words leave your mouth. In that fraction of a second where you assess what the other person can receive and adjust accordingly. It happens when you feel the pull of a genuinely interesting idea and then sense the conversation is not going in that direction and let it go without mentioning it. It happens in the quiet accumulation of moments where the fullest version of your thinking never makes it into the room, because some part of you has already calculated that it would not land. This is the loneliness of the translator. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but of being perpetually engaged in self-reduction in order to remain in connection with people who matter to you. The loneliness of knowing that the version of you that shows up in most conversations is a carefully managed edition, and that the unedited version mostly lives in private. What makes this particularly painful is that the translation is not deceptive. It is an act of genuine care, of wanting to stay in relationship with people who cannot always meet you at the depth you naturally inhabit. But care that is entirely unreciprocated in its architecture eventually produces a particular loneliness that feels shameful to admit. The loneliness of being the one who always adjusts, the one for whom no one has ever thought to ask, "Where are you actually, and what is it like to be there?" When you spend years translating yourself downward, the thoughts and perceptions you have learned to edit out of conversation do not disappear. They accumulate, living in a space that has no outlet because the social world consistently signals that it cannot hold them. Over time, that accumulation creates the pressure of a life lived at a depth that is never quite fully expressed, of an interior significantly larger than any external space ever made available for it. The translation was never the solution. It was the survival strategy, and there is a difference between surviving connection and actually having it. The unlived versions of yourself. There is a particular form of grief that deeply thinking people carry that has almost nothing to do with what has happened in their lives, and almost everything to do with what has not. Not the losses that arrived with clear edges, but the softer, more ambiguous grief of paths not taken that were never quite chosen against. Versions of yourself that were possible, and then gradually, without drama, became impossible. lives that existed in potential for long enough that part of you began to inhabit them and then did not arrive. Deeply thinking people are particularly vulnerable to this form of grief because they can see possibility with unusual clarity, where other people might perceive a situation as it is. A deeply thinking person perceives it as it is and as it could be, simultaneously, automatically. This capacity for imagining forward, for inhabiting potential futures with enough vividness that they feel almost real, is one of the most generative aspects of a deeply thinking mind. It is also one of the most quietly painful ones, because every vivid potential future that does not materialize is a small loss, and a life lived at depth accumulates a great many of those small losses. The versions of yourself that did not happen are not trivial. They were real possibilities that lived in you long enough to shape you, to generate hope that was real, even if the outcome never arrived. The person you thought you might become by this point in your life. The relationship you believed was possible before something shifted. The version of your work that existed in your mind with a clarity the actual execution never quite matched. What deeply thinking people often do with this grief is carry it as a private narrative of failure, a story in which they have not lived up to their own potential, have not become what they were capable of becoming. This narrative is almost never fully accurate, but it is almost always present, generating the particular exhaustion of someone who is never quite able to feel that what they have done and who they are is enough. The unlived versions of yourself are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of depth. Only a mind capable of imagining possibility with genuine vividness accumulates this particular kind of grief. The grief is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged, not reframed into something more comfortable, not resolved prematurely with optimism about what is still possible, just acknowledged, with the kind of precise and unflinching honesty that deeply thinking people are capable of when they are willing to turn that capacity inward without judgment. You are not behind. You are someone who has been living with an unusually rich interior life in a world that did not always make adequate space for it. And some of what was lost deserves to be grieved before it can be released. When intelligence becomes isolation. There is a particular social dynamic that deeply thinking people encounter so consistently across the different contexts of their lives that it eventually stops registering as a dynamic and begins to feel simply like the nature of social reality. It is the experience of being in a room, a relationship, a conversation, and being aware at some level that you are operating at a different register than the people around you, not in the arrogant sense of believing yourself superior, but in the more uncomfortable sense of perceiving that the connection you are capable of and the connection that is available in this particular environment are not the same thing, and that the gap between them cannot be bridged by trying harder or being more open. This is the isolation that intelligence produces when it has nowhere adequate to go. Not the isolation of being explicitly rejected, but the subtler and more disorienting isolation of simply not quite fitting, of consistently finding that the conversations you are most drawn to are the ones that do not happen, that you move through most social environments with a portion of your actual thinking held in reserve because there is nowhere to put it. Most social environments are optimized for breadth rather than depth. Deeply thinking people do not connect well at the surface. They connect through ideas, through honesty about difficult interior experiences, through conversations that go somewhere real. And those kinds of conversations are not what most social settings are structured to produce. The result is a person who can be surrounded by people and still feel fundamentally alone, not because the relationships are not real, but because the specific kind of connection that would address their particular form of loneliness is rare enough that they may go extended periods of their life without experiencing it. This isolation intensifies over time. Early in life, the mismatch often presents as shyness or social awkwardness. With time, it becomes more refined, less about not knowing how to navigate social environments and more about knowing how to navigate them very well, while simultaneously knowing that skilled navigation is not the same as genuine connection. The deeply thinking adult who has learned to move through social environments smoothly often carries a more acute form of loneliness than the deeply thinking child who had not yet learned to perform comfort, because the adult knows exactly what is missing and has decades of evidence that it is consistently difficult to find. There is also a secondary layer of isolation that develops when deeply thinking people begin to hide the full range of their thinking, because they have learned that displaying it consistently creates a particular kind of relational friction. So they learn to hold back, to ask fewer of the questions they actually want to ask, to make themselves easier to be around by becoming less fully themselves. The way through this is to develop enough clarity about what genuine connection requires for you specifically that you stop accepting the absence of it as normal, and become willing to seek out the rarer relationships and conversations that can actually meet you where you are. Not as a rejection of ordinary connection, but as a recognition that you have been undernourished in a specific way for a long time, and that addressing that is not selfishness. The exhaustion of always being ahead. There is a specific cognitive pattern that deeply thinking people experience so consistently that it becomes part of the background texture of their lives, something they often do not identify as a pattern at all, but simply as the way thinking works. It is the experience of living slightly ahead of the present moment, of perceiving where a situation is going before it has arrived there, of carrying an anticipatory awareness that runs continuously beneath the surface of ordinary experience and processes the future in the background while the present is still happening. This is not the same as worry, though it is often mistaken for worry. It is something more specific, a perceptual orientation toward implication and consequence that operates automatically, that cannot be turned off by deciding to be more present, because it is not a habit of mind that was chosen, but a feature of how the mind processes information, running ahead of events to model their probable trajectories, flagging the complications and emotional weight of things that most people around you will not register until they actually arrive. When you are consistently living a step ahead of the present, you are also consistently carrying the weight of things that have not happened yet, processing losses before they occur, grieving the end of things while they are still present. This creates a form of emotional preloading that is exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain, because from the outside, you appear to be reacting to things that have not happened yet, and from the inside it can feel like you are always carrying more than you can see a clear reason for, always slightly heavier than the moment itself explains. Deeply thinking people often begin to mourn things before they end, which means they spend portions of the best moments of their lives also experiencing those moments as already passing, as already moving toward the loss they can see coming, even when it is not imminent. The person who understands that everything ends at a level that is felt rather than merely known often cannot be fully in a good moment without also being aware somewhere in their nervous system that it will cost something when it goes. Living ahead also creates a particular relational difficulty. When you can see where something is going before it has revealed itself, you are often in the position of knowing things in relationship that the other person does not yet know, carrying that knowledge alone, because the moment for addressing it has not technically arrived yet. What would it mean to put down some of this anticipatory weight? Not to stop perceiving implications, but to develop a more deliberate relationship with them, to distinguish between the implications that require action now and the ones that can be acknowledged and then set aside, and to recognize that seeing ahead is useful, but living ahead is a form of paying twice for what you will eventually experience anyway. The self you stopped introducing. There is a version of you that you stopped bringing into rooms a long time ago, not because you decided to hide it, not because of a single event that made it feel unsafe, but because the accumulated signal from years of ordinary social experience was clear enough that the learning happened without you choosing it. The fullest version of what you are makes people uncomfortable, and the discomfort eventually falls on you to manage. So you made adjustments. Small ones at first, then larger ones, then adjustments so habitual they ceased to feel like adjustments at all, and began to feel like personality. You learned which ideas to voice and which to let dissolve quietly. You learned to enter a conversation at the level it was already occupying, rather than the level you might have preferred. You learned to stay quiet during the moments where what you actually wanted to say would have required more explanation than the situation could support. What this produced over time is a self shaped at least as much by what it learned not to do as by what it naturally is. A self that carries the weight not only of what it expresses, but of everything it has learned to withhold. The withholding is not neutral. It costs something to consistently be present in a situation while simultaneously monitoring the distance between your actual response and the one you are offering in its place, in the continuous low-grade expenditure of attention that is always running in the background, always assessing, always managing the gap. The grief in this is quiet, but persistent. It is the grief of a self that has been in relationship with the world for years, sometimes decades, without being fully introduced. The grief of knowing that the people who know you best know a version of you that is genuine as far as it goes, but does not go all the way to the edge of what you actually are. The grief of wondering, in moments of honesty, whether anyone has ever really seen the thing you most essentially are, or whether what they have seen is always the translated edition, the managed version, the self that learned to make itself receivable at the cost of being complete. The self you stopped introducing did not disappear. It is still there, still generating the observations and perceptions and connections that no one ever quite sees, still waiting in a kind of interior patience for a context large enough to receive it. Recognizing that it is still there and that it still matters is not a small thing. It is in many ways the beginning of a different relationship with your own life. The permission you never received. There is something that deeply thinking people have been waiting for, in many cases for most of their lives, that has never arrived and that no one around them has known to offer. It is not advice, and it is not validation, in the ordinary sense of being told that their feelings are understandable. It is something more specific, and it is so basic that the absence of it is difficult to name without feeling that it should not have been necessary in the first place. It is permission. Permission to be the way they actually are, without the freight of apology or explanation or the perpetual low-grade effort of justifying a way of existing in the world that does not fit comfortably into the categories the world has made available. Permission to need more time alone without that need being treated as a social failure. Permission to feel things at the intensity they are actually felt. Permission to want connection of a specific kind and depth without being told that the standards are too high. The absence of this permission does not usually arrive in dramatic form. It comes from the accumulated weight of ordinary social feedback, from the countless small moments across a life in which the message was delivered, indirectly but consistently, that the way a deeply thinking person naturally is requires some adjustment, some softening, some reduction. It comes from being told as a child that they were too sensitive, too serious, too intense, too much. It comes from years of social environments that rewarded the performance of ease and penalized the authentic expression of depth. What this accumulation produces is a self-relationship in which the deeply thinking person has internalized the message that their natural way of being requires management, that the unedited version of themselves is too much for ordinary life to accommodate, and that the work of being acceptable is their permanent responsibility. This self-management is so habitual that most deeply thinking people do not recognize it as effortful anymore. But it is still costing something, in the form of a diffuse drain on available energy that is hard to locate but real in its effects, in the low-level fatigue that persists even on days when nothing particularly demanding has happened. The permission that matters most is the one that is granted internally, the decision to stop treating one's own nature as a problem to be managed and to start treating it as a reality to be inhabited. To stop apologizing in the small continuous ways that function as apology, for needing what you need, feeling what you feel, thinking the way you think. You are not, in any meaningful sense, too much. You are exactly as much as you are, and what you are has been carrying an unnecessary weight of self-justification for long enough that setting it down will feel strange before it feels like relief. The permission was always yours to give, and the waiting has gone on long enough. Coming home to a mind like yours. Everything in this video has been moving toward a single point that is simple to state and genuinely difficult to arrive at, not because the idea itself is complex, but because arriving at it requires undoing something that was built slowly, over a long time, out of materials that felt like reality rather than like construction. The point is this: the way your mind works is not a problem. Not a problem to be managed, not a liability to be offset by other qualities. The depth at which you think and feel and perceive is not an excess of something ordinary. It is a different relationship with experience altogether, one that comes with real costs that deserve to be acknowledged and real grief that deserves to be named. But it is not, at its root, a deficit. It is a different way of being conscious, and the suffering that has accompanied it has not come primarily from the depth itself, but from the sustained experience of inhabiting that depth in a world that did not know what to do with it. The grief you have been carrying is real. The exhaustion of being a translator in every room you enter is real. The loneliness of perceiving at a depth that most people around you do not access is real. The weight of living slightly ahead of the present is real. The quiet mourning of the unlived versions of yourself, the paths that closed without drama and without witness, is real. None of this needed to be minimized, and none of it needs to be resolved by reframing it into something more comfortable than it actually is. What it needs is to be seen accurately, to be understood not as a collection of traits that make social navigation complicated, not as too sensitive or too intense or too internal, but as someone with a particular kind of mind that has been doing an enormous amount of work, quietly and largely without acknowledgement for most of your life. To have that work recognized not as the neurotic output of a mind that cannot relax, but as the genuine labor of a person who processes reality at a depth that most people are not called upon to sustain. Coming home to a mind like yours does not mean arriving at a place where the costs disappear. It means arriving at a place where you understand the costs clearly enough that you stop paying the ones that are optional, where you stop reducing yourself as a reflex before you have even tested whether the room can hold you, where you stop waiting for permission that was always yours to give and extend to yourself with the same quality of attention you have been extending to everyone else for years. The basic recognition that the way you are is not something that requires apology. You do not owe anyone a simpler version of yourself. The depth is not the problem. The depth was never the problem. The problem was the absence of a framework for understanding what it means to carry it, what it costs, and what it is worth. You now have the beginning of that framework. What you do with it is, as it has always been, entirely yours.